I spent 38 years raising my daughter alone, working double shifts, skipping meals, and sacrificing everything so she could have the life I never did. So when I sat in that grand ballroom on her wedding day watching her smile in a dress I could barely afford to help pay for, I thought, this was finally my moment too. But then her father-in-law stood up, raised his glass, and looked straight at me. And in front of everyone he said, "Some people here built their lives on lies." The room went silent. My daughter froze. And I realized, he wasn't just toasting the couple, he was destroying me. If this moment already stirred something in your heart, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps stories like mine reach others who need them. And if you believe family stories matter, consider subscribing. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? I'd love to know who's here with me. My name is Judith Stephens. I'm 62 years old, and until recently, I lived a quiet, predictable life in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where people still wave when they pass your driveway, where the grocery store cashier knows your name, and where nothing much changes unless you count the seasons. For most of my life, I didn't mind that kind of simplicity. In fact, I clung to it. Because stability, no matter how modest, was something I had fought very hard to give my daughter. Her name is Lily, and she has been the center of my world since the day she was born. I raised Lily alone, completely alone. Her father, Thomas Reed, disappeared when she was barely 2 years old. One day he was there, quiet, thoughtful, always carrying the weight of something I couldn't quite understand, and the next day he was gone. No note, no explanation, no phone call, just gone. I waited for him at first. God, I waited. I kept thinking maybe there had been an accident or that something had happened he couldn't control. I called hospitals, police stations, even distant relatives I barely knew. But after weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the truth settled in like a slow, heavy fog. He had left us, and I was on my own. I was 30 years old with a toddler, a high school diploma, and no safety net. So I did what women like me have always done. I survived. I took whatever jobs I could find. During the day, I worked as a school secretary, filing papers, answering phones, keeping things running smoothly behind the scenes. At night, I cleaned offices downtown. On weekends, I sometimes picked up shifts at a diner just off the highway where truck drivers and late-night regulars never asked too many questions. There were nights I barely slept. Nights when my feet ached so badly I had to sit on the edge of the bathtub just to cry for a few minutes before getting back up and doing it all over again. But Lily never saw the worst of it. I made sure of that. She had warm meals even when mine were smaller. She had school supplies even if I had to put them on a credit card I couldn't afford. She had birthday parties, simple ones but full of laughter, and Christmas mornings where somehow there were always gifts under the tree. I sold things quietly over the years. My mother's silver bracelet, a pair of earrings I had once saved up months to buy, even my wedding ring. Not because I stopped believing in love, but because I believed in my daughter more. And Lily, she made it all worth it. She grew into the kind of person people naturally trust. Kind, steady, compassionate. The kind of young woman who notices when someone is struggling and steps in without being asked. In school, she worked hard not because I pushed her, but because she understood somehow what it had cost to give her those opportunities. When she told me she wanted to become a pediatric nurse, I remember smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. "You've always had a way with kids," I told her. She laughed. "I think I got that from you." Maybe I did something right after all. When Lily got accepted into a good nursing program, I cried in the car before calling her back so she wouldn't hear the tremble in my voice. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to relief. Like maybe just maybe, she was going to have a life that didn't feel like a constant uphill climb. And she did. She graduated. She got a job at a children's hospital. She moved into her own apartment, nothing fancy but clean and safe and hers. Every time I visited, I'd catch myself looking around thinking, this is what all those years were for. Then about 3 years ago, she told me she had met someone. His name was Andrew Collins. He's different, Mom, she said one evening over the phone, her voice soft in a way I hadn't heard before. Different. I didn't know exactly what she meant at the time, but I understood soon enough. Andrew was an attorney, well-spoken, calm, thoughtful in a way that felt genuine, not rehearsed. When I met him for the first time, he looked me in the eye, shook my hand firmly, and said, "I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Stephens. Not Judith. Not something overly familiar. Respectful. I appreciated that. He didn't talk down to me, didn't make me feel small for not understanding certain things. When I asked questions, simple ones, probably he answered them with patience. And more importantly, he loved my daughter. That was the part that mattered most. For a while, I allowed myself to relax, to believe that maybe Lily had found not just love, but stability. A partner who would stand beside her, not disappear when things got hard. But then, I met his parents, and that's when something inside me shifted. Edward and Margaret Collins lived in Connecticut in a home that felt less like a house and more like a statement. The kind of place with high ceilings, polished floors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than a living room. I remember standing at the front door, smoothing down my dress, suddenly aware of every small imperfection. When Edward opened the door, his eyes moved over me, not rudely, not obviously, but in a way that made me feel assessed, measured, and quietly dismissed. "Ah," he said, his voice polished but cool. "You must be Lily's mother." I smiled politely. "Yes. Judith Stephens. It's nice to meet you." He nodded just slightly. "Of course." Margaret stood just behind him, offering a softer smile, but even then there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Not unkind, but cautious. Dinner that night was uncomfortable. Not because anyone raised their voice, not because there was open conflict, but because of the things left unsaid. Edward asked questions about my work, my background, my life in Ohio, all perfectly reasonable on the surface, but each one felt like it had an edge beneath it. And Lily's father, he asked at one point, cutting into his steak with precise movements. "Is he involved?" The room went still. I kept my voice steady. "No. He left when she was very young." Edward nodded slowly, as if filing that information away. "Unfortunate," he said. "These things tend to shape people in ways they don't always understand." Lily shifted in her seat. Andrew cleared his throat. But Edward simply took a sip of his wine as though nothing unusual had been said. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being overly sensitive. But as the evening went on, I noticed something else. Every time the conversation drifted too close to the past, to anything personal, anything real, Margaret would subtly change the subject. Not abruptly, not obviously, but deliberately, and Edward would let her. At the time, I didn't understand why. I just knew that when I left that house, something didn't feel right. Like I had stepped into a room where everyone knew something, except me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had something to do with my daughter. Lily didn't fall in love the way some people do, quickly, recklessly, as if chasing a feeling. She fell in love the way she did everything else in life, carefully, thoughtfully, with her whole heart, but never blindly. She met Andrew during a volunteer program at the children's hospital where she worked. He had been assigned there through a legal outreach initiative helping families navigate insurance issues and hospital policies. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered, and that more than anything was what first drew her to him. "He listens, Mom," she told me once, her voice soft but certain. Really listens. Not just waiting for his turn to talk. That mattered to Lily. It mattered to me too. Over time, I saw how steady he was. He didn't try to impress with grand gestures or expensive gifts, though I knew he could afford them. Instead, he showed up. He called when he said he would. He remembered small details. He treated Lily like someone whose feelings carried weight. And when he looked at her, there was no calculation in it. Just respect. So when he proposed, I wasn't surprised. But I was afraid. Not of Andrew, of the world he came from. Because love is one thing. But families can complicate everything. The Collins family lived in a world that was very different from ours. Their lives moved in circles of influence, expectation, and quiet judgment. The kind of world where appearances weren't just important, they were currency. And I had none of that. The first time Lily invited me to Connecticut for a proper dinner with Andrew's parents, I spent hours deciding what to wear. It sounds foolish now, but I stood in front of my closet longer than I care to admit, holding up dresses that suddenly felt too plain, too outdated, too me. In the end, I chose something simple. Navy blue, clean lines, nothing flashy. It was the best I could do. Andrew greeted me warmly when I arrived, pulling me into a brief, respectful hug. Lily squeezed my hand as we stepped inside, as if she could feel the tension in me even before a word was spoken. "Everything's going to be fine," she whispered. I wanted to believe her. But the moment Edward Collins entered the room, I felt that same quiet unease from before. He carried himself like a man who had spent his entire life being listened to. Every movement controlled, every word measured. Even his smile felt practiced. "Mrs. Stephens," he said again, extending his hand. "Judith is fine," I replied gently. He gave a small, polite smile. "Of course." But he didn't use it. Margaret was already seated at the dining table, arranging napkins with careful precision. When she looked up at me, her expression softened just enough to make me think she wanted to say something more, but chose not to. Dinner began pleasantly enough. The table was set beautifully, crystal glasses, polished silverware dishes that looked too delicate to use. I found myself watching how everyone else moved, how they held their forks when they spoke, when they stayed quiet. It had been a long time since I'd felt out of place. Edward led most of the conversation. He asked Lily about her work, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than admiration. "Pediatric nursing," he said, nodding slowly. "Admirable. Though I imagine emotionally taxing." "It can be," Lily replied. "But it's meaningful." "Yes," he said, as if acknowledging a polite idea rather than a truth. "Meaning has its place." Then his attention shifted to me. "And you, Mrs. Stephens, you've worked in education, I believe." "Yes," I said. "I was a school secretary for many years." "Many years," he repeated. "Consistency is commendable." Something about the way he said it made it sound like the opposite. I kept my smile steady. "I did what I needed to do." "I'm sure you did." There it was again, that tone. Not outright rude. Not something you could point to and say, "This is disrespect." But enough to make you feel like you were being placed somewhere lower. Andrew tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, asking me about life in Ohio, about the town I lived in. I answered, grateful for the shift. But Edward wasn't finished. "And Lily's father?" he asked suddenly. The question landed heavier this time. I saw Lily stiffen beside me. I kept my voice calm. He's not part of our lives. Edward studied me for a moment, his eyes sharp but unreadable. No contact at all. No, I said firmly. He leaned back slightly in his chair, tapping his fingers once against the table. Interesting, he murmured. Andrew's jaw tightened. Dad, he said quietly, a warning in his tone, but Edward only smiled faintly. I'm simply trying to understand the family we're welcoming into ours. The words sounded generous. They didn't feel that way. Margaret set her glass down a little too quickly. Edward, she said, her voice light but edged. Perhaps we can talk about something more pleasant. He glanced at her, and for just a second, I saw something flicker between them, something unspoken. Then it was gone. Of course, he said smoothly. My apologies. But the damage had already been done. The rest of the evening moved forward, but the atmosphere had changed. Lily tried to keep things light. Andrew did his best to bridge the gaps, and Margaret, she watched. Always watching. At one point, I excused myself to use the restroom. I needed a moment alone to breathe, to steady myself, to remind myself that I had nothing to be ashamed of. As I walked down the hallway, I passed a study with the door slightly ajar. I hadn't meant to look inside, but something caught my eye. A photograph, framed, placed carefully on a shelf. I slowed just for a second. It showed Edward younger, much younger, standing beside a group of men. They were dressed differently than he was now, less polished, more real. One of the men looked familiar, not in a clear way, not enough to place him immediately, but enough to send a strange, uneasy feeling through me. Before I could step closer, Margaret's voice came from behind me. Mrs. Stephens! I turned quickly. I'm sorry, I said. I was just looking for the restroom. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course. It's just down the hall. I nodded and moved past her. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been concerned about where I was going. She had been concerned about what I might see. When I returned to the table, everything looked the same. But it didn't feel the same. Because now I knew something for certain. Edward Collins wasn't just a man who looked down on me. He was a man who was hiding something. And whatever it was, it had something to do with the past I thought I had already survived. Wedding planning, I've learned, isn't just about flowers and dresses. It's about power. And once the Collins family stepped in, it became very clear who was expected to have it and who wasn't. Lily had always dreamed of something simple. Not small, but meaningful. A ceremony filled with warmth, not spectacle. She told me once sitting at my kitchen table back in Ohio that she didn't want anything too showy. I just want it to feel real, Mom, she said, tracing the rim of her coffee mug. Not like a performance. I smiled at her, then brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then that's exactly what you'll have. I meant it. But somewhere between that quiet conversation and the first official meeting with the Collins family about the wedding, things changed. The venue was the first sign. Instead of the modest but elegant garden space Lily had initially considered, Edward insisted on a historic estate just outside Hartford. The kind of place with towering columns, manicured lawns, and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a museum. It reflects the importance of the occasion, he said, as though that settled the matter. Lily hesitated. I could see it in her eyes. But then she glanced at Andrew, and he gave her a small reassuring nod. It's beautiful, she said softly, and just like that, it was decided. From that moment on, Edward took control of nearly everything. The guest list grew longer. Names Lily didn't recognize, people from Edward's business world, associates, donors, acquaintances who had more to do with his reputation than her life. The seating chart became a strategic puzzle carefully arranged to ensure certain people were seen in certain places. Presentation, Edward called it. Every detail matters, he said during one of the planning meetings, his tone calm but absolute. A wedding is not just a celebration, it's a statement. I sat quietly through most of those meetings, hands folded in my lap, watching as decisions were made faster than I could process them. Occasionally, Lily would glance at me as if checking whether I was okay, and I would always give her the same small smile. I didn't want to be the reason her day became complicated, but the truth was, I was already starting to feel like a guest in something I had once believed I was part of. There were moments, small ones at first, that I tried to brush off, like when I offered to help with the invitations. "I've always enjoyed that kind of thing," I said lightly. "Addressing envelopes, organizing lists." Edward barely looked up from his tablet. "That won't be necessary," he replied. "We've hired a professional service." Or when I suggested a family-style dinner instead of plated courses. "It might feel more intimate," I said. Margaret gave me a polite smile, but Edward answered, "We prefer something more structured." "We," that word again. It became clear slowly but unmistakably that we did not include me. Lily noticed, of course. One evening after a particularly long planning session, she pulled me aside. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said quietly, her eyes tired. "I know this isn't exactly what we talked about." I reached for her hand. "It's your wedding, sweetheart," I told her gently. "Whatever makes you happy." She hesitated. I don't want to fight with them right now. There's so much going on. Can you just bear with it? Just until the wedding is over?" There it was, not a request, a plea, and how could I say no to that? So I nodded. "Of course," I said. "I can handle a few months." What I didn't realize then was how much those months would cost me. As the weeks passed, the distance between me and the rest of the planning only grew. Emails were sent that I wasn't included on. Decisions were made before I even knew discussions had happened. When I did offer input, it was acknowledged politely and then ignored. Andrew tried in his own way to bridge the gap. "Mrs. Stephens, what do you think about the music selection?" he asked once, sliding a list toward me during a meeting. I appreciated that. I really did. But before I could answer, Edward spoke. "We've already finalized that." Andrew's expression tightened slightly, but he said nothing. And I let the moment pass, because I was learning something important. This wasn't about music, or flowers, or seating charts. This was about control. And Edward Collins did not share control. The clearest sign came about 3 weeks before the wedding. We were reviewing the photography plan timelines, group shots, locations. The photographer, a young woman with a calm professional demeanor, walked us through the list. Bride and groom with immediate family, she said, scanning her notes. Then extended family, then friends. She read off the names included in the first group. Lily, Andrew, Edward, Margaret. A pause. "That should be it for the primary family portrait," she added. Something in my chest was tightened. I waited. Surely she would correct it. But no one said anything. Not Edward, not Margaret. Even Lily seemed momentarily frozen, as if she hadn't fully registered what had just happened. I cleared my throat gently. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think there may have been a small oversight." The photographer looked up. "Oh, I'm the bride's mother," I said. Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, of course, I'm so sorry. I'll add you in." Before she could write it down, Edward spoke. "We've structured the primary portrait to reflect the Collins family line," he said smoothly. "There will be additional photos afterward." Additional photos. As if I were optional. As if the woman who had raised the bride from infancy was somehow secondary. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I kept my posture straight. Andrew set his pen down a little harder than necessary. "Dad," he said, his voice firm, "Judith should be in the main portrait." Edward turned to him slowly. "This is about maintaining clarity in the family presentation." Andrew didn't back down. "She is Lily's family." The room went quiet. For a moment, I thought Edward might push further, but then he gave a small, measured nod. "Very well," he said. "Include her. Her. Not Judith. Not even Mrs. Stephens. Just her." The photographer quickly adjusted her notes, the tension dissolving on the surface. But inside me, something had shifted. Because that moment, small as it might seem to someone else, told me exactly where I stood. Not as an equal, not even as a respected outsider, but as someone to be managed, included when necessary, minimized when possible. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. These hands had worked double shifts, had packed lunches, wiped tears, signed school forms, held a frightened little girl through fevers and nightmares. These hands had built a life, and yet in that room, they had felt invisible. I told myself it didn't matter, that once the wedding was over, things would settle, that Lily would move forward with her life and I would return to mine, that this was just a temporary discomfort for a greater happiness. But deep down, I knew better, because Edward Collins wasn't just organizing a wedding. He was shaping a narrative, one where everything and everyone fit neatly into his version of the world, and I had a growing feeling that I didn't belong in it at all. By the time I arrived in Connecticut the week before the wedding, I told myself I had already adjusted. Adjusted to the silence when I spoke. Adjusted to the polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. Adjusted to being present, but not truly included. Still, nothing quite prepared me for how clearly the line would be drawn once everything became real. Lily had arranged for me to stay at a small inn about 15 minutes from the estate. When she told me she looked apologetic, almost guilty, "I thought you'd be more comfortable there, Mom," she said gently. "It's quieter. Less chaotic." And maybe that was true, but I knew the other truth too. The Collins family and most of their guests were staying at a luxury resort attached to the estate grounds, a place with marble floors, spa services, and private balconies overlooking manicured gardens. I had seen the pictures online. I didn't belong there. So I smiled and told Lily it was perfect. And in some ways it was. The inn was warm, welcoming, and simple. The owner, a woman not much younger than me, greeted me like an old friend. My room had soft lighting, a quilted bedspread, and a window that looked out over a quiet stretch of trees. It reminded me of home. But every morning when I drove to the estate and stepped into that world of polished elegance, the contrast hit me all over again. The first few days passed in a blur of rehearsals, fittings, and final preparations. And in between those moments, the small humiliations continued. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet enough to make you question whether they were intentional. Like the afternoon Lily and the bridesmaids went to the spa at the resort. "I thought you might want to join us," one of the bridesmaids said casually when I saw them leaving. I turned to Lily. She looked confused for a second, then glanced at Margaret. "Oh, I thought Mom wasn't interested," she said. Margaret offered a gentle smile. "I must have misunderstood," she said. "It all happened so quickly." "Of course it did." I waved it off. "You girls go ahead," I said lightly. "I'll be fine." And I was. But it wasn't about the spa, it was about the pattern. Another moment came during a small pre-wedding gathering and informal dinner for close friends and family. Edward stood near the bar speaking with a group of well-dressed guests. When Lily and I approached, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Ah, there she is," he said, his tone warm for her. Then his eyes flicked to me. "And this is—" He paused just long enough to make it noticeable. "Lily's mother. No name. No acknowledgement of anything beyond that single biological fact." I smiled politely, extending my hand. "Judith Stephens." A few of the guests nodded, offering polite greetings, but I saw the way their attention drifted back to Edward almost immediately, because in that room he was the center, and I was peripheral. Later that evening, something happened that stayed with me longer than I expected. I had stepped away from the main room to get a glass of water. As I stood near one of the service tables, a man approached me, mid-50s, well-dressed, carrying an empty glass. "Excuse me," he said, barely looking at my face. "Could you point me to the restroom?" For a second, I didn't understand. Then I realized. He thought I worked there. I felt a brief flash of embarrassment, but I kept my voice calm. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm actually a guest." He blinked, surprised. "Oh, my apologies." He walked away quickly, but the moment lingered. Not because of the mistake itself, but because a small part of me wondered, what had made it seem so believable? Was it my dress, my posture, or simply the fact that in a place like this, someone like me didn't quite fit the expected image of a guest? That night back at the inn, I sat by the window and stared out into the dark. I thought about all the years behind me, all the things I had done to ensure Lily would never feel small, and here I was feeling exactly that. But I pushed it down, because this wasn't about me, it was about her, and I could endure a few uncomfortable moments for the sake of her happiness. At least, that's what I told myself. The next day, something shifted. It started quietly. Margaret found me alone near the garden, just beyond the main tent where the final decorations were being arranged. "Mrs. Stephens?" she said softly. I turned, offering a polite smile. "Margaret." She hesitated, glancing back toward the house as if making sure no one was watching. "I hope you're settling in," she said. "I am," I replied. "Everything looks beautiful." She nodded, but her expression remained tight. For a moment, it seemed like she might walk away. But then she didn't. Instead, she stepped a little closer. "There's something I've been meaning to say," she said, lowering her voice. I felt my chest tighten slightly. "Yes." She looked at me carefully, as though choosing her words with extreme caution. "Edward can be particular," she began. I almost smiled at the understatement. "I've noticed," I said gently. Her lips pressed together. "He values control," she continued, "and appearances." There was something more behind her words. I could feel it, but I prompted quietly. She exhaled just slightly. "But sometimes that comes from fear." Fear. The word didn't seem to fit the man I had seen. Fear of what I asked. Margaret hesitated again, and this time the silence stretched longer. Finally, she spoke. "Of the past," she said. A chill moved through me. "The past," I repeated. She nodded. "There are things Edward has spent a long time keeping buried," she said. "Things he believes could complicate matters." My mind immediately went to the conversation at dinner, to the way Edward had reacted when Thomas was mentioned. To do with Lily, I asked carefully. Margaret's eyes flickered. For a moment, I thought she might answer directly, but instead she shook her head just slightly. I shouldn't say more, she said quickly. It's not my place. I took a step closer. Margaret. I said, my voice steady but firm. If there's something I need to know. There is, she interrupted. The words landed heavier than anything else she had said. My breath caught. But you won't hear it from me, she added, her voice almost trembling now. Then from who? She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. And in her eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. Not judgment, not superiority, but fear. You'll hear it from him, she said softly. From Edward. I felt my stomach drop. And when you do, she continued, just remember, not everything is what it seems. Before I could respond, she stepped back, her expression closing off once again. I should go, she said quickly. There's still much to prepare. And just like that, she walked away, leaving me standing there alone in the garden with a single thought echoing in my mind. Edward wasn't just controlling the wedding. He was controlling something much bigger, something tied to the past, something he was afraid of losing control over. And for the first time since I arrived, I realized this wasn't just about being unwelcome, it was about being dangerous, even if I didn't yet understand why. The morning of the wedding arrived far too quickly. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the soft light barely touching the edges of the curtains in my room at the inn. For a moment I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the world outside, the distant sound of a car passing, the faint rustle of wind through the trees. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, there was a weight in my chest I couldn't quite name. I sat up slowly, pressing my feet against the floor, grounding myself in the moment. Today was Lily's wedding day. Whatever discomfort, confusion, or tension had built over the past week, none of it mattered as much as that. This was her day, and I was determined not to let anything take that away from her. I dressed carefully, choosing the one outfit I had spent weeks deciding on. A soft lavender dress, simple, elegant, nothing too bold. I had stood in front of my mirror back home more times than I could count, wondering if it was enough. Now, as I smoothed the fabric over my hands, I told myself it didn't matter. I would be enough. For her, when I arrived at the estate, everything was already in motion. Staff moved quickly but quietly, setting final details into place. Flowers were being arranged, chairs aligned, ribbons adjusted. Everything looked perfect. Lily was in one of the upstairs rooms, surrounded by her bridesmaids, the air thick with hairspray, laughter, and nervous excitement. When I stepped inside, the noise softened for just a moment. "Mom," she said, her voice warm but strained. I smiled, walking toward her. "Good morning, sweetheart." She stood, and for a second we just looked at each other. And then she wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't a long hug. Not like the ones she used to give me when she was little, tight, clinging, full of need. This one was softer, more careful. But it was real. "You look beautiful," I whispered. She pulled back, her eyes shining just slightly. "Not yet," she said with a small laugh. "Give me another hour." I stayed with her as the final preparations unfolded. I helped adjust the back of her dress, careful not to disturb the delicate lace. I held her veil while one of the bridesmaids secured it into place. For a brief stretch of time, everything felt right, like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us again. "Do you remember," she said suddenly, her voice quieter now, "when you used to braid my hair before school?" I smiled, my fingers pausing for just a moment. "Every morning," I said, "even when you complained the whole time." She laughed softly. "I didn't complain that much." "You absolutely did," I replied, smiling wider. "But you still asked for it every day?" She looked at me, then really looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. Mom. She started hesitating. Yes. She glanced toward the door, making sure no one was close enough to hear. Can I ask you something? My heart tightened slightly. Of course. She took a breath. It's about Dad. The words still carried weight even after all these years. I kept my voice steady. What about him? She swallowed. Edward said something a few days ago. Of course he did. I felt a flicker of irritation quickly buried beneath calm. What did he say? Lily hesitated again, her fingers twisting lightly in the fabric of her dress. He said that sometimes people don't just leave, she said slowly. That sometimes there are reasons things happen that aren't obvious. I felt my chest tighten. That's a very vague thing to say, I replied carefully. She nodded. I know, but then he asked me if I had ever questioned why you never talked about it. About him. About what happened. I looked at her, searching her face. And have you? I asked quietly. Her eyes flickered. I don't know, she admitted. I guess I always just accepted what you told me. That he left. That was it. That was what I knew, I said firmly. She nodded, but the doubt hadn't fully left her expression. Edward made it sound like there was more to it, she said. Like maybe you didn't tell me everything. The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were new, but because they were coming from her. I took a slow breath. Lily, I said gently, stepping closer. I have never lied to you about your father. She looked at me, searching for something. I know, she said quickly. I'm not saying you did. I don't understand why he would say something like that. Neither did I. Or maybe I was starting to. I can't speak for Edward, I said. But I can tell you this, your father was a complicated man. There were things he carried that he never shared with me. And one day, he was gone. She held my gaze. You really don't know why. There it was, the question that had followed me for decades. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I don't. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room outside filled again with laughter and movement, but around us there was a quiet bubble of tension. I just don't want there to be anything, she began, then stopped. Anything, what I asked softly. Anything that could come back and hurt us, she said finally. Us. I reached for her hands. Whatever happened in the past, I said, my voice steady despite the unease growing inside me, it has nothing to do with who you are, or the life you're building now. She nodded slowly. I know. But I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. And that hurt more than I expected. Because after everything, after all the years, all the sacrifices, I had believed that one thing was certain, that she trusted me. A knock came at the door, breaking the moment. 5 minutes, one of the coordinators called. Lily's shoulders straightened slightly. Okay, she said more to herself than to me. I squeezed her hands gently. You're going to be fine, I said. More than fine. She smiled, but it was faint. I hope so, as the room filled again with movement, bridesmaids adjusting dresses, voices rising in excitement. I stepped back, giving her space. But inside me, something had shifted. Edward's words had reached her, planted something, and I didn't know how deep it went. As I made my way out of the room, closing the door quietly behind me, I felt that same weight from the morning return, heavier now. Because whatever Edward was planning, it wasn't just about humiliating me. It was about changing how my daughter saw me. And that was something I didn't know how to fight. Not yet. The ceremony itself was beautiful. For a little while, everything that had been building the tension, the unease, the quiet humiliations faded into the background. As I took my seat in the second row, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the trees, I allowed myself to breathe. This, I told myself, was what mattered. Lily walked down the aisle slowly, her arm linked with Andrew's, her face radiant in a way that made my chest ache. Not because she looked perfect, though she did, but because she looked happy. Truly happy. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel all week. Pride. Not the kind Edward Collins spoke about, polished, controlled, tied to appearances, but something deeper, quieter, earned through years of effort no one else had seen. I remembered the little girl who used to run into my arms after school, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, the teenager who stayed up late studying at the kitchen table, the young woman who held my hand the day she got her first job at the hospital, and now here she was, standing at the altar, building a life that for so long had felt just out of reach. The vows were heartfelt. Andrew's voice steadied Lily's trembling just slightly as she spoke. There were a few soft laughs, a few tears. Even Edward, seated near the front, maintained an expression that could almost be mistaken for approval. For a moment I wondered if I had been wrong, if perhaps I had misjudged things, if maybe, just maybe, the tension would dissolve once the ceremony was over. But that feeling didn't last, because the reception was where everything changed. The ballroom was even more extravagant than I had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting warm light across tables set with precision. The air was filled with soft music, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation. People smiled. They congratulated. They celebrated. And I stood among them, doing my best to match their energy, even as a quiet unease settled back into my chest. Dinner passed without incident. Toasts were announced, carefully planned, neatly timed. A few close friends spoke, sharing light-hearted stories. Andrew's best man drew laughter from the crowd. Then it was Edward's turn. Of course it was. He rose from his seat, slowly adjusting his jacket with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of standing in front of people. The room quieted almost immediately. He lifted his glass. To Andrew and Lily, he began, his voice smooth, carrying effortlessly across the room. A gentle murmur of agreement followed. A union built on promise, on potential, and on the blending of two very different worlds. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table. Different worlds. There it was again. Marriage. He continued, is not just about love. It is about truth, about understanding where we come from and what we bring into the future. The words were still neutral, careful, but something in his tone had shifted. I saw Andrew glance at him, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Lily remained still, because Edward went on, taking a slow sip of his drink. No matter how much we try to shape our lives, the past has a way of lingering. The room was completely silent now. I felt it before I understood it. The shift. The turn. And then he looked at me. Directly. There was no mistaking it. No matter how carefully it is hidden, he added. A ripple of unease moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable. Andrew set his glass down. Dad, he started. But Edward lifted a hand, slightly silencing him without even looking in his direction. I believe Edward said calmly that when two families come together, transparency is important. Don't you agree? No one answered. No one knew how. My heart was pounding now, loud enough that I was sure I could hear it over the silence. because sometimes he continued, his voice lowering just enough to draw people in the story we are told, is not the whole story. Lily turned her head slightly, her eyes flickering toward me, confused, uncertain. And then Edward reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My breath caught. He pulled out something small, flat, a photograph. I think he said, holding it up just enough for those closest to see that it's only fair to acknowledge the truth, before we all raise our glasses in celebration. Andrew stood abruptly. Enough, he said sharply. This isn't the time or place. But Edward didn't stop. Isn't it? He replied coolly. A wedding is about honesty, is it not? It's about respect, Andrew shot back. Edward's gaze flickered to him briefly. And respect, he said, must be earned. Then his eyes returned to me. The weight of them was suffocating. Mrs. Stephens, he said, his voice calm but cutting. Would you care to explain why this photograph exists? My hands felt cold. I didn't want to look, but I did. And the moment I saw it, everything inside me froze. It was old, faded at the edges, but I recognized it instantly, a younger version of myself, standing beside a man, Thomas, and someone else. My breath caught in my throat, because the third figure in that photograph was Edward, younger, less polished, but unmistakably him. A low murmur spread through the room. Confusion, curiosity, judgment. What is this? Lily whispered, her voice trembling. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Because in that moment, everything I thought I understood about my past shifted. And Edward took a step forward. Strange, he said, his tone almost conversational now, how certain connections are, conveniently forgotten. Andrew moved toward him, his expression dark. Stop this, he said, now. But Edward held his ground. I simply believe, he continued, raising his voice just enough to command attention again, that we should know exactly who we are welcoming into this family. There it was. Not implied, not hidden, spoken clearly, publicly. And I stood there, unable to move, unable to defend myself. Because the truth was, I didn't fully understand what I was seeing either. The photograph trembled slightly in Edward's hand, and for the first time since this all began, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just an attack. This was a revelation, and I was at the center of it, whether I was ready or not. The silence after Edward revealed the photograph wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. I could feel every pair of eyes in that room shifting, some curious, some judgmental, some simply waiting to see how this would unfold. The soft music that had once filled the space was gone. Even the staff had paused, as though instinctively sensing something had gone terribly wrong. Lily's voice was the first to break through it. Mom, she whispered. There was something in the way she said it, fragile, uncertain, that hurt more than anything Edward had said. I turned toward her, my throat tight. I started, but Edward cut in. Please, he said smoothly, though there was nothing polite about it. Take your time. I'm sure this is difficult to explain. Andrew stepped between us, his voice sharp. You've made your point. Sit down. But Edward didn't move. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the room, holding the photograph up just enough for more people to see. This was taken over 30 years ago, he said. Before any of us imagined we would be standing here today. He glanced at me again. Isn't that right? Judith. Hearing my name on his lips after days of being reduced to her, or Mrs. Stephens felt like a deliberate choice. A weapon. Yes, I said, finally my voice quieter than I intended. It was a long time ago, and yet he continued, "It seems to be a part of your life that was never mentioned." "I didn't know it was relevant," I replied, trying to steady myself. "Relevant," Edward repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You don't consider your connection to me." "Relevant." A murmur moved through the guests again. Lily looked between us, her confusion deepening. "You knew each other?" she asked, her voice trembling now. I swallowed. I didn't realize it was him," I admitted. "Not at first. That much was true. The man in that photograph, he had been younger, rougher around the edges. Not the composed, powerful figure standing before us now, but the recognition had come fast, and with it, a flood of questions I didn't yet have answers to." Edward gave a soft, humorless chuckle. "How convenient," he said, "to forget something like that." "I didn't forget," I said, a little more firmly now. "I just didn't know who you had become." Andrew turned to his father, his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're twisting something from decades ago into a public spectacle." Edward's expression hardened. "I am ensuring transparency," he replied. "Something I value highly." "Then maybe you should start with your own past," Andrew shot back. For a split second, something flickered across Edward's face. Not anger. Not yet. Something sharper. More dangerous. "Careful," he said quietly. Margaret stood suddenly, her chair scraping lightly against the floor. "Edward," she said, her voice tense. "That's enough." But he didn't stop. "Because what concerns me," he continued, his tone rising slightly, "is not just that Mrs. Stephens knew me. It's that she knew me under circumstances she has never disclosed." My heart pounded harder. What was he doing? What was he trying to say? "I have disclosed everything that mattered," I said, though even as I spoke, I felt the uncertainty creeping in. Had I, or had there always been gaps? Things I never fully understood. Edward tilted his head slightly. "Have you?" he asked. Then before I could respond, he took another step forward. "Tell me," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Did you ever tell your daughter what kind of man Thomas Reed really was?" The name hit the room like a shockwave. Lily's breath caught. "Dad," she whispered, though she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at him, at Edward, waiting. "No," I said immediately, because I only ever told her the truth. And what truth was that Edward pressed? That he left, I said, my voice stronger now. That he walked away from us. Edward let out a slow breath, almost as if he had been expecting that answer. "Yes," he said. "That's certainly one version of events." "Stop it," Andrew snapped. "You don't get to do this here." But Edward was no longer listening to him. He was focused entirely on me. "And did you ever question why he left?" he asked. "Or did you simply accept it because it was easier?" I felt something shift inside me. A mix of anger and something else. Something colder. I spent years wondering why I said my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. But I never had answers. And neither did you. Edward's lips curved slightly. "Didn't I? The words hung in the air. Heavy, unsettling. Margaret stepped forward now, her voice sharper than before. "Edward, you are not going to say another word," she said. There was a crack in her composure now. Fear. Real fear. Edward turned to her slowly. "Why not?" he asked. "Because you're afraid of what might come out." Her face paled. "That's enough," she said again, but this time it sounded more like a plea. The room was no longer just tense. It was on edge. People were shifting in their seats, whispering quietly, unsure whether to stay or leave. And in the center of it all was me. Lily looked back at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't bear to see. Doubt. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Is there something you're not telling me? That question. After everything. After all these years." It cut deeper than anything else. "No," I said firmly. "There isn't." But even as I said it, I knew something had changed. Not in what I knew, but in what she believed. Edward took a slow step back as if satisfied with the damage he had already done. "I'm not here to ruin anything," he said, his tone almost calm again. "I simply believe that families should be built on honesty." Andrew laughed bitterly. "Then you've failed spectacularly," he said. Edward ignored him. Instead, he looked at Lily. "You deserve to know where you come from," he said. Lily's hands trembled at her sides. "I thought I did," she whispered. My chest tightened. "Lily!" But she stepped back. Just slightly, and that small movement felt like a wall being built between us. Margaret closed her eyes briefly as if bracing herself, and in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. She hadn't been trying to protect Edward. She had been trying to stop this, to stop him from going too far, from saying something that couldn't be taken back. I looked at her, searching for answers, and she met my gaze. There was no hiding it now. She knew the truth, more than I did, more than anyone else in that room, and she was terrified of it coming out. Edward lowered the photograph slowly. "This isn't over," he said quietly, though it was loud enough for those closest to hear. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. "It's not." Because whatever had just been set in motion was bigger than a ruined speech, bigger than a wedding. It was about the past, about Thomas, about something that had been buried for decades, and for the first time, I wasn't just confused. I was afraid. Afraid of what I might learn. Afraid of what it might cost, and most of all, afraid that I was about to lose the one person I had spent my entire life trying to protect. My daughter. The reception never recovered. Even though the music eventually resumed and the staff tried to restore some sense of normalcy, something had shifted too deeply to be repaired with polite smiles and clinking glasses. Conversations became quieter, more cautious. People leaned into one another, whispering behind raised hands. Some guests began to leave early, offering quick congratulations that felt hollow. But I barely noticed any of it, because all I could see was Lily walking away from me, not running, not angry in a loud, explosive way, just stepping back, like she didn't know where I belonged anymore. "Lily," I called softly, following her as she moved toward one of the side corridors. She didn't stop at first. Andrew caught up to her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Hey," he said quietly. "Let's just take a breath, okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were distant. I reached them a moment later, my heart pounding. "Sweetheart, I need a minute, Mom," she said, her voice strained but controlled. The words weren't harsh, but they weren't warm either. And that distance, it hurt. "I understand," I said quickly. There are things I need to explain." "Then explain them," she said, looking at me now. Really looking. And for the first time, I saw doubt clearly in her eyes. because right now she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what's real anymore. The words hit harder than Edward's speech ever could. I've never lied to you, I said, my voice steady but soft. Not about anything that mattered. Then why didn't you tell me you knew him? She asked, gesturing back toward the ballroom. Because I didn't know it was him, I said. Not until tonight. She shook her head slightly. That doesn't make sense, she said. You were in that picture with him. And Dad. The way she said it, Dad sent a sharp ache through me. I knew your father, I said carefully, and I knew people he was connected to. But that was a lifetime ago. I didn't recognize Edward for who he was now. He's changed. Andrew stepped in gently. Lily, your mom isn't the one who did something wrong here, he said. My father... This isn't just about him, she interrupted. Her eyes were back on me. It's about what he said, she continued. About there being more to the story. About you not telling me everything. I felt the ground shift beneath me again. There isn't anything else I said. Not that I know. That last part lingered in the air. Not that I know. Because suddenly, I wasn't as certain as I used to be. Lily saw it too. The hesitation. The crack. And it was enough. I need space, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Please. Andrew looked torn, his gaze moving between us. I'll stay with her, he said quietly. I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to hold on to her to make her understand. But I couldn't force that. Not now. So I stepped back and watched her walk away. Again. The corridor felt colder once they were gone. Quieter. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. But there was only one thought that kept rising to the surface. Edward knew something. Something about Thomas. Something I didn't. And whatever it was, he had been waiting for the perfect moment to use it. I turned back toward the ballroom, my steps slower now, more deliberate. I wasn't running from this anymore. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. Edward. I found him in one of the private lounges just off the main hall. Of course, away from the crowd, away from witnesses. He was standing near a window, his back partially turned, a glass of whiskey in his hand. For a moment, he looked almost relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if he hadn't just torn apart his own son's wedding. Enjoying yourself? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He turned slowly. There was no surprise in his expression. I was wondering when you'd come, he said calmly. I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. What do you want? I demanded. His lips curved slightly. Clarity, he said. The same thing I've always wanted. Don't play games with me, I said. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You hurt your own son, your own daughter-in-law. I told the truth, he replied simply. You told part of something you barely explained, I shot back, and you did it in the cruelest way possible. He took a slow sip of his drink, studying me over the rim of the glass. Cruelty is subjective, he said. Perspective shapes everything. Then let's talk about perspective, I said, stepping closer. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been waiting for this moment. His eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps I have, he admitted. The honesty caught me off guard. Why, I asked. What did I ever do to you? For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Something deeper. You existed, he said. The answer made no sense. What does that even mean? He set his glass down slowly. It means he said that your presence has always been inconvenient. Inconvenient, I repeated, disbelief rising in my voice. Yes, he said, because you are a reminder. A reminder of what? He held my gaze. Of a time I have spent decades putting behind me. My heart pounded harder. This is about Thomas, I said. His silence confirmed it. What happened to him? I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. Edward looked away briefly as if considering how much to say. Then he turned back to me. Your version of events, he said slowly, is that he abandoned you. That's not a version, I said. That's what happened. Is it? He asked. The doubt in his tone sent a chill through me. Yes, I said firmly. He left. He disappeared. I waited for him. I searched for him. And then I accepted that he was gone. Edward studied me for a long moment. And you never wondered why he asked? Of course I did, I snapped. But I didn't have answers. And neither do you. His expression darkened slightly. That's where you're wrong, he said. The words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. I took a slow step closer. Then tell me, I said. He hesitated. Just for a second. And in that moment I saw it. Not confidence, not control, but something else. Something that looked almost like regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You're not ready for that, he said, my hands clenched at my sides. You don't get to decide that, I said. I already have, he replied. Anger surged through me. You don't get to stand there and destroy my relationship with my daughter and then tell me I'm not ready for the truth. I said, my voice shaking now. You owe me answers. He shook his head slightly. No, he said. I owe you nothing. The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Because I realized something then. This wasn't just about control. This wasn't just about appearances. This was about something Edward had buried so deeply that even now he was afraid to bring it fully into the light. And whatever it was, it had the power to change everything I thought I knew. About Thomas, about my past, about myself. I stepped back slowly, my mind racing. This isn't over, I said. Edward picked up his glass again, his composure returning. No, he agreed. It isn't. And as I turned to leave the room, one thought echoed louder than anything else. If Edward wouldn't tell me the truth, then I would have to find it myself, no matter what it cost. I didn't go back to the ballroom, not right away. The music the laughter forced as it now sounded felt like noise I couldn't bear. Instead, I stepped outside into the cool night air, letting the quiet wrap around me like something steady and real. My hands were trembling, not from fear alone, but from something deeper. For 30 years, I had lived with a single version of the past. Thomas left. That was the story. Simple, painful, final. But now? That story had cracks, and those cracks were widening. I walked slowly along the edge of the estate grounds, past the rows of carefully arranged flowers, past the glow of string lights that had been placed to create a perfect atmosphere for celebration. It all felt surreal now, like a stage set for a moment that had already collapsed. Judith. The voice came from behind me, soft, uncertain. I turned. Margaret stood a few steps away, her posture tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she took a small step forward. "I was looking for you," she said. "I imagine you were," I replied quietly. She winced slightly at the edge in my tone. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came quickly, too quickly, for what I asked, for what he said, or for what you didn't. Her eyes lowered briefly, for both. I studied her. There was no performance in her expression now, no careful politeness, just exhaustion and fear. "You knew this was going to happen," I said. "It wasn't a question." She hesitated. "I knew he was building towards something," she admitted, "but I didn't think he would do it like that. Not tonight." "At his own son's wedding," I said bitterly. "You didn't think he'd go that far?" "I hoped he wouldn't," she said softly. Hope. It felt like such a fragile word in the face of everything that had just happened. I crossed my arms, trying to steady myself. "Then tell me," I said. "What is this really about?" Margaret looked around as if making sure we were alone. Then she stepped closer. "What I'm about to say." I have never said out loud, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart began to race again. "You need to," I replied. "Because right now my daughter is questioning everything she knows about me." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know," she said, "and that's exactly why I came to find you." She took a breath. "Thomas didn't leave you," she said. The words hit me like a physical force. I felt my body go still. What I whispered. "He didn't abandon you," she continued. "Not the way you believe." I shook my head immediately. "No, I lived it. He was there one day and gone the next. No explanation, no contact, nothing." "I know," she said, "but that doesn't mean he chose to leave." My chest tightened. "Then what are you saying?" I asked. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "I'm saying there were things happening at that time. Things you weren't aware of. Like what?" She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might stop, but then she didn't. "Edward wasn't always the man you see now," she said. I've gathered that I replied dryly. Her lips pressed together briefly. In his early years, she continued, he was involved in business ventures that weren't exactly legal. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What kind of ventures?" I asked. She met my eyes. Financial schemes, partnerships that operated in gray areas. Sometimes darker than that. My mind immediately went to the photograph, to the younger version of Edward, to Thomas. "Thomas was involved?" I asked. Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes." The word echoed in my head. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's not possible. He wasn't that kind of person." "I believe you," she said quickly. "From what I understand, he didn't start out that way. But he got pulled into it, and by the time he realized what was really happening, it was too late." I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting again. Too late for what I asked. Margaret swallowed. Too late to walk away without consequences. My heart pounded louder. "What kind of consequences?" She hesitated again, and this time the silence stretched long enough to make my chest tighten painfully. "Margaret," I said, my voice firm now. "I need the truth." She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I could only describe as guilt. "Thomas found out about something Edward had done," she said slowly. "Something that could have destroyed everything he was building." My breath caught. "What?" "I don't know all the details," she admitted. "Edward never told me everything, but I know it involved money, a lot of it, and people who would not have taken kindly to being exposed. I felt a chill run through me. And Thomas, I prompted. He wanted out, she said. Not just out, he wanted to come clean, to report what was happening. The image of Thomas in my memory shifted, not as a man running away, but as a man trapped. Did he tell Edward, I asked? Margaret nodded. Yes, and her eyes closed briefly, and shortly after that, he disappeared. The words hung in the air, heavy, terrifying. I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the nearest railing. No, I said, shaking my head. No, that doesn't mean anything. People disappear all the time. It doesn't mean... It means something, Margaret said quietly. I looked at her sharply. Are you saying Edward? I don't know, she interrupted quickly. I need you to understand that. I don't know exactly what happened, but I do know this Edward made sure there was no investigation that could be traced back to him. Records were altered. Connections were severed. My stomach turned. And you stayed with him? I asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. Her expression crumpled slightly. I was young, she said, and I was already dependent on him, financially, socially. Walking away wasn't as simple as it should have been. I stared at her. For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Anger, pity, disgust, all of it tangled together. And you've known this all these years, I asked. Not everything, she said, but enough to know that the story you were told wasn't the full truth. I turned away, my mind racing. Thomas hadn't left. He had tried to do the right thing, and then he was gone. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I told Lily he abandoned us. I said, my voice barely a whisper now. Margaret stepped closer. You told her what you believed to be true, she said gently. But it wasn't. I said. The words felt like they were tearing something open inside me. All these years, all that anger, all that hurt. And now, I didn't even know who it belonged to anymore. Edward knows more, Margaret said softly. That's why he's afraid. I turned back to her. Afraid of what? She met my gaze. Of the truth coming out. My heart pounded again. And you think he humiliated me tonight because of that? I asked. She nodded. He wanted to control the narrative, she said, before anyone else could. I let out a slow breath. Everything was starting to make sense. In a terrible, devastating way. He's not done, Margaret added quietly. I looked at her. What do you mean he's going to keep pushing? She said. Because as long as he controls what people believe, he stays safe. A cold determination settled inside me. For years, I had accepted a version of the past that painted me as the one left behind, the one abandoned. But now I knew something different, something dangerous. Thomas hadn't left. He had been taken out of my life, and Edward Collins was at the center of it. I straightened slowly, my hands no longer trembling. This isn't over, I said. Margaret nodded. No, she said. It's just beginning. And for the first time since the wedding began, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was ready to fight for the truth, for my daughter, and for the man I had spent 30 years believing had chosen to leave me behind. I didn't sleep that night. I went back to the inn sometime after midnight, though I couldn't remember the drive. The road blurred past me in fragments, headlights, empty intersections, the quiet hum of the engine, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. 30 years. 30 years of believing a man had abandoned me when he might have been trying to do the right thing. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my dress, staring at nothing. Thomas hadn't left. The thought repeated itself over and over again, like my mind was trying to force it into something solid, something real. But every time I reached for it, it slipped. Because if that was true, if Margaret was right, then everything I had built my life around was based on something incomplete. And that realization, it was devastating. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was filled with pale morning light. For a moment, I forgot. Then it all came rushing back. The wedding, Edward's speech, the photograph, Margaret's confession, Lily. I reached for my phone immediately. No messages. My chest tightened. I didn't know what I had expected. Maybe a text from Lily. Maybe something, anything that would tell me she wasn't pulling away completely. But there was nothing. I stood slowly, my body heavy, and moved to the small desk in the corner of the room. My bag sat there slightly open from the night before. Inside it were the things I had brought with me, including the past. I hadn't thought about it in years. Not really. I had packed it away physically and emotionally because there had never been a reason to revisit it. Until now. I pulled out the small envelope from the bottom of my bag. It was worn at the edges, the paper softened by time. Inside were the last things I had kept from Thomas. A few photographs, a receipt from a diner we used to visit, and a letter. I hadn't read it in over 20 years. Not because I couldn't, but because it had never answered the question that mattered most. Why did you leave? My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, messy in places, rushed in others. I took a breath and began to read. Judith, if you're reading this, then I didn't get the chance to say this to you in person. And I'm sorry for that, more than you'll ever know. There are things happening right now that I can't explain fully, not because I don't trust you, but because the less you know, the safer you are. I never wanted this life for us. I never wanted you to be caught up in any of it. But I made choices, and now I have to deal with the consequences. I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to get out. And if I can, I will come back to you, to both of you. Tell Lily. Tell her I love her. Every single day, no matter where I am. And tell her I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. If anything happens, if I don't make it back, please know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Both of you were. I'm so sorry. Thomas. The letter slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the desk. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I had read those words before, years ago, but I hadn't understood them. Not really. Back then, they had felt like excuses, like the kind of vague explanations someone gives when they don't want to face the truth. But now they felt like something else entirely. A warning, a goodbye. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes. He didn't leave, I whispered. The words felt fragile, but they were real. And suddenly, everything Margaret had said made sense. Thomas had been trying to get out, to expose something. And Edward, I clenched my hands, forcing the thought into focus. Edward had been part of it. Maybe not everything, maybe not directly, but enough. Enough to be afraid, enough to try to control the story. A knock at the door startled me. I wiped my face quickly, my heart racing again. Judith Andrews' voice. I moved to the door and opened it. He stood there, his expression tired but steady. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. "Of course," He walked in slowly, glancing around the room as if taking in the simplicity of it.
"I should have come sooner,"
he said. "It's all right," I replied quietly. "How is Lily?" He hesitated.
"She's struggling," he admitted. "Last night was a lot."
I nodded.
"I know."
He looked at me, his gaze searching.
"I don't believe what my father said," he said firmly. "Not the way he said it."
Relief flickered briefly in my chest.
"Thank you,"
I said.
"But,"
he continued, and that word made my stomach tighten again, "there are things we don't understand. And Lily, she needs clarity. I want to give her that," I said. "I just didn't have it before." Andrew stepped closer.
"Do you have it now?"
he asked. I turned back to the desk, picking up the letter. "This might help," I said, handing it to him. He took it carefully, reading it in silence. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed. From focus to something heavier. When he finished, he looked up at me.
"He didn't leave,"
he said quietly.
"No,"
I replied. "He didn't." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening.
"This changes things," he said. "Yes," I said. "It does."
He looked down at the letter again.
"My father knew him,"
he said.
"That much is clear now. And more than that," I added.
Andrew nodded slowly.
"I've already started looking into it,"
he said. After last night, I couldn't just ignore it. Hope flickered inside me.
"What have you found?"
"Not enough," he admitted.
"But there are inconsistencies, gaps in records,
business dealings that don't quite add up." I exhaled slowly.
"He's been hiding something," I said.
Andrew met my gaze. "I think so too." For a moment we stood there in silence, two people connected by someone we both cared about, trying to make sense of a past neither of us had fully known.
"I want to help,"
he said finally.
"For Lily, for you, for the truth."
I nodded.
"Then we start."
"Now," I said, because for the first time in decades, I wasn't just holding on to a story. I was holding on to evidence, proof that Thomas had tried to come back, proof that he had loved us, and proof that whatever had taken him away wasn't as simple as I had once believed. Andrew folded the letter carefully, handing it back to me.
"We need more than this," he said. "But it's a start."
"Yes," I agreed. And as I placed the letter back into the envelope, one thing became clear. Edward had tried to control the narrative, but he had made one mistake. He had pushed too far, and now the truth was starting to come out, whether he was ready for it or not. By mid-morning, the estate felt like a different place. The decorations were still there, flowers, fresh tables, immaculate ribbons untouched, but the energy had shifted completely. Where there had been celebration, there was now tension. Where there had been laughter, there were hushed conversations and careful glances. The wedding hadn't ended, but it had fractured. Andrew insisted we return together.
"Lily needs to hear this,"
he said, his voice steady but urgent.
"Not later. Not after more damage is done. Now."
I agreed, even though part of me feared what that conversation would bring. We found Lily in one of the smaller sitting rooms just off the main hall. The door was slightly ajar, and through the narrow gap I could see her sitting on the edge of a sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller, not physically, but emotionally, like something inside her had collapsed overnight. Andrew knocked gently before pushing the door open.
"Lily,"
he said softly. She looked up, her eyes immediately moving to him and then to me. The hesitation was still there, but so was something else. Pain.
"Can we come in?"
he asked. She nodded. Neither of us spoke at first. Andrew closed the door behind us, giving the room a sense of privacy that felt both necessary and heavy. "I need to show you something," he said finally. He glanced at me and I gave a small nod. This had to come from him. He stepped forward holding out the letter.
"It's from your father,"
he said. Lily's breath caught. "My father," she repeated. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Andrew said. "Your mom kept it. She just didn't fully understand what it meant until now." Lily looked at me, and for the first time since the night before, I saw something soften in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but openness. Slowly she reached for the letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The room was silent as she read. I watched her face carefully, the way her eyes moved across the page, the way her expression shifted confusion, then realization, then something deeper. Grief. By the time she reached the end, tears were already falling. "He didn't leave," she whispered. The words broke something open in my chest. "No," I said softly. "He didn't." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with emotion. "You thought he did," she said. "I did," I admitted. "For a long time I did." Her grip tightened on the paper. "But he was trying to come back," she said. "Yes." And something stopped him. I nodded slowly. "That's what we believe." Silence settled over the room again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating, just full. Full of things that needed to be said. Lily wiped her tears, her breathing uneven. "Why didn't you tell me about this letter?" she asked. The question was gentle, but it still carried weight. "I didn't understand it," I said honestly. "At the time it felt like an excuse, something he wrote to ease his conscience." She nodded slightly. "I think I would have felt the same," she admitted. Relief moved through me. Small, but real. Andrew stepped in. "There's more," he said. "Things my father hasn't told us." Lily's expression hardened slightly. "I figured," she said. "He knew your father," Andrew continued. "More than just casually. They were involved in something together." Lily looked at him sharply. What kind of something? Andrew hesitated. "Business," he said. "But not the kind you'd be proud of." Her eyes flickered toward me. "And Mom didn't know." "No," I said firmly. "If I had, I would have—" "You would have." What a voice interrupted. We all turned. Edward stood in the doorway. I hadn't heard him approach, but there he was, composed, controlled, as if nothing had changed. "Come in," Father Andrew said, his tone cold. "Since you're already listening." Edward stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I wasn't listening," he said calmly. "I was looking for my son." "And you found him," Andrew replied, "along with the truth you've been trying to bury." Edward's gaze shifted to the letter in Lily's hand. "So he said you found that." Lily stood slowly. Her hands were still shaking, but her posture had changed. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She was standing. "Is it true?" she asked. Edward raised an eyebrow. "What part?" "That my father didn't leave," she said. "That he was involved with you. That he was trying to expose something." The room held its breath. Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Yes,
he said. The word landed heavily. My heart pounded. You admit it. Andrew said disbelief in his voice. I admit, Edward replied, that Thomas was involved in certain business matters with me, and that he became difficult. Difficult. Lily repeated, her voice rising. He was trying to do the right thing. From your perspective, Edward said coolly. From any perspective, Andrew snapped. Edward ignored him. He made choices, he said, and those choices had consequences. My anger flared. What did you do to him? I demanded. Edward's gaze shifted to me. I did nothing, he said. Nothing, I echoed. He disappeared. Records were altered. And you expect me to believe you had nothing to do with that. I expect you to understand that the world is more complex than you think, he replied. That's not an answer, Lily said sharply. Edward's expression tightened slightly. I am not on trial here, he said. Maybe you should be. Andrew shot back. Margaret's voice came from behind him. Yes, she said quietly. We all turned again. She stood in the doorway now, her expression pale but resolute. Maybe you should be, she repeated. Edward's eyes narrowed. Margaret, he said, a warning in his tone. But she didn't back down. I've been silent for too long, she said. And I won't be any more. The air in the room shifted again, this time in a different direction, toward something inevitable, something that had been building for years. You told me it was over, she continued, her voice trembling but steady. You told me it was handled. It was, Edward said. No, she said. It was hidden. Silence. Sharp. Unforgiving. Lily looked between them, her breathing uneven. What does that mean? She asked. Margaret stepped forward. It means, she said, her eyes never leaving Edward's, that your father didn't just disappear. My heart stopped, and in that moment, I knew. Whatever came next would change everything. No one moved. It was as if the entire room had frozen in place, suspended in the moment just before something irreversible would be spoken. Lily stood in the center, still holding the letter in her trembling hands. Andrew was beside her now, close enough to steady her if she fell. I remained where I was, my heart pounding so violently it felt like it might break through my chest. And Margaret? Margaret stepped fully into the room. This ends today, she said quietly. Edward's expression hardened. You don't know what you're doing, he replied. No, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I know exactly what I'm doing, for the first time in a very long time. She turned toward Lily, then to me. You both deserve the truth, she said. Yes, I whispered. We do. Edward exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face in a rare break from his usual composure. You think telling them will fix anything, he asked Margaret. You think it will undo what's already been done. No, she said, but it will stop the damage from continuing. He let out a humorless laugh. The damage, he repeated. You think this moment isn't already damage enough? This isn't about embarrassment, Margaret said. It's about what you've been hiding. Edward's eyes flashed. I haven't hidden anything that matters, he snapped. That's not true, Andrew said. And you know it. Edward turned to him, his patience thinning. You have no idea what you're talking about. Then explain it, Andrew shot back. Explain why a man disappeared after threatening to expose you. Explain why records don't line up. Explain why you're so desperate to control this narrative. Edward said nothing. And that silence, spoke louder than anything else. Lily took a step forward. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I need to know what happened to him." Her words filled the room with something raw, something undeniable. Edward looked at her, really looked at her. And for a brief moment I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not control, but conflict. Then it was gone. "You're asking questions you may not want the answers to," he said. "I already don't like the answers I have," she replied. "So try me." Margaret stepped closer. "Edward," she said softly. "It's time." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something had shifted. Not softened, but resigned. "Thomas Reed came to me," he said finally. The words landed like a stone in still water. "He had discovered certain irregularities in our business dealings," Edward continued. "Transactions that could have drawn unwanted attention." "You mean illegal activity," Andrew said flatly. Edward didn't deny it. He was naive, he said instead. He believed he could simply walk away, that he could report what he had seen and come out untouched. "And you didn't want that," I said. "No," Edward replied calmly. "I didn't." My stomach twisted. "What did you do?" Lily asked, her voice barely holding together. Edward hesitated, and for the first time, he looked like a man standing at the edge of something he could no longer avoid. "I tried to reason with him," he said, "to make him understand the consequences, not just for himself but for others involved. And when that didn't work, Andrew pressed." Edward's jaw tightened. He became a liability. The words were cold, clinical. But beneath them, there was something else. Something darker. "What does that mean?" Lily asked. Edward didn't answer immediately. Margaret did. "It means," she said, her voice shaking, "that he was followed." My breath caught. What I whispered. Edward shot her a sharp look. "That's enough," he said. "No," she replied. "It isn't." She turned back to us. "He didn't disappear on his own," she said. "People were sent to watch him, to make sure he didn't speak to anyone, to contain the situation." "Contain," Andrew repeated. "You're talking about a man, not a leak." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said. "I felt like I was standing outside my own body, watching, listening, trying to understand. And then I asked, my voice barely audible." Margaret swallowed. "There was an accident," she said. Edward closed his eyes again. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he muttered. The room spun. "An accident," Lily repeated. "What kind of accident?" Margaret looked at Edward. He didn't stop her this time. "He was being followed," she said. "And there was a confrontation. Things escalated. He tried to run. My hands shook, and I forced out. He was hit by a car," she said. The words shattered something inside me. "No," I whispered. "It was never meant to go that far," Edward said quickly. "It was supposed to be a warning, a deterrent." "A warning," Andrew snapped. "He died." Edward's composure cracked. "I didn't give the order for that," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "It went beyond what was intended. But you covered it up," I said. The room went silent again. Edward didn't answer. He didn't have to. "Tell me you didn't," I said, stepping forward, my voice trembling with anger and grief. "Tell me you didn't erase him like he never existed." He looked at me, and in that moment, I saw it. The truth. "I protected what I had built," he said quietly. The words hit harder than any confession. Lily let out a broken sound. "Oh my God," she whispered. Andrew put an arm around her, holding her as she swayed slightly. "You let my father die," she said, her voice hollow. "And you made it look like he abandoned us." Edward said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. I felt the tears streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. For 30 years, I had carried anger toward a man who had never chosen to leave me, and the man responsible for that lie had stood in front of me, judging me, humiliating me. Why, I asked, my voice breaking. Why would you do that to us? Edward's expression hardened again, because the alternative would have destroyed everything he said. My business, my reputation, my family. "And what about mine?" I cried. "What about the family you destroyed?" He didn't answer, because in his world, that had never mattered. Lily pulled away from Andrew, her face pale but resolute. "You don't get to be part of my life anymore," she said. Edward flinched, just slightly, but it was enough. "You're my daughter," he said. "No," she replied. "I'm not." The words hung in the air, final, unyielding. Andrew stepped forward. "You need to leave," he said. Edward looked at him, then at Margaret. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't defend him. For the first time in his life, he stood alone. And as he turned and walked out of the room, I realized something. The man who had tried to destroy me publicly had just destroyed himself completely. The silence after Edward walked out didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of everything we had avoided for far too long. No one spoke at first. Lily stood frozen, her hands still clutching the letter, her body trembling in a way that no one could mistake now. Andrew stayed close, one hand resting gently at her back, steadying her without saying a word. And me. I couldn't move, because the truth once spoken doesn't settle gently. It crashes, it breaks, it leaves behind pieces you don't know how to put back together. He didn't leave me. The words slipped from my lips without permission. Soft. Broken. He didn't leave us. Lily let out a sharp breath like something inside her had finally given way. "No," she whispered. "He didn't." She looked at me then. Really looked at me. And this time, there was no doubt, no distance, only pain. And something else. Understanding. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, her voice trembling as tears fell freely down her face. The apology hit me harder than I expected. For what I asked, my own voice unsteady. For thinking. She struggled to find the words. For even wondering if you had hidden something from me. For not standing up for you last night. For letting him... "Lily," I said quickly, stepping forward. I took her hands, holding them tightly. "You were hurt," I said. "You were confused. Anyone would have been. But I should have trusted you," she insisted. "After everything you've done for me. I should have known." I shook my head gently. "Trust doesn't mean never having questions," I said. "It means being willing to come back and find the truth together." Her grip tightened around mine. "I didn't come back fast enough," she said. "You came back," I replied softly. "That's what matters." For a moment we just stood there, holding on to each other, not as mother and daughter separated by doubt, but as two people who had just lost something and found something else in its place. Grief, truth, and a chance to begin again. Andrew cleared his throat quietly. We need to think about what comes next, he said.
The practical weight of his words settled into the room. Because this wasn't over. Not really. Margaret stepped forward slowly, her face pale but composed in a way that suggested she had already accepted what this would cost her.
There will be consequences, she said.
Andrew looked at her.
There should be, he replied.
She nodded. There will be investigations, she continued. Questions about the past, about the business, about everything Edward tried to bury.
And you?
Lily asked. Margaret met her gaze. I will tell the truth, she said simply. The honesty in her voice was quiet, but firm. I should have done it years ago, she added. I was afraid. I told myself I was protecting my family, but all I did was allow something terrible to continue. Her eyes shifted to me.
I am deeply sorry,
she said. I studied her for a moment. There were many things I could have said. Anger, blame, accusation. But what I saw in front of me wasn't the woman who had ignored me at dinners or redirected conversations. It was someone who had lived with fear for a long time. Someone who had finally chosen to stop. That matters now, I said quietly. Telling the truth matters. She nodded, her expression softening just slightly. I hope it's not too late, she said. Lily exhaled slowly, wiping her face. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Andrew turned to her.
We take it one step at a time, he said. We focus on what's real, on what matters.
She looked at him, her expression fragile but steadying.
And what about
this? She asked, gesturing around the room, though we all knew she meant more than just the wedding. Andrew followed her gaze. Then he looked back at her.
This doesn't define us, he said. Not unless we let it.
She nodded slowly. I don't want this to be what our marriage starts with, she said.
It won't be,
he replied. I watched them, something warm and painful rising in my chest at the same time. Because despite everything, they were still choosing each other. That mattered. Maybe.
We don't continue today,
Lily said after a moment.
Not like this.
Andrew didn't hesitate.
Then we don't,
he said.
What about the guests she asked?
They'll understand, he replied.
And if they don't, that's not our problem.
A small, tired smile touched her lips. That sounds like something Mom would say, she said. I let out a quiet breath. Maybe you've been listening more than you thought I said. She stepped closer, resting her head briefly against my shoulder. I've always been listening, she whispered. The weight of those words settled deep. For years I had worried about what I couldn't give her, what she might have missed. But in that moment, I realized something. She hadn't missed the most important things. Not really.
We'll do this again,
Andrew said suddenly. Lily lifted her head. What? The ceremony, he explained. The vows, the whole thing, but differently. On our terms. She blinked. You mean another wedding? Not another one, he said. The real one. She let out a soft laugh, though tears still clung to her lashes. That sounds complicated. Maybe he admitted, but it would be honest. She looked at me. What do you think? I smiled gently. I think you deserve a day that feels like yours, I said, not someone else's version of it. She nodded slowly. Then we'll do it, she said. Margaret watched quietly from the side. And for the first time since I had met her, she didn't look distant. She looked relieved, as if something she had carried for years had finally been set down.
Outside the room, the estate continued its careful illusion of normalcy, but inside, everything had changed. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. And as I stood there holding my daughter's hand, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel so soon. Not peace, not yet, but something close, because the truth had come out, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying the weight of a lie. Time has a strange way of softening what once felt unbearable, not erasing it, not fixing it completely, but reshaping it into something you can finally carry without breaking. 3 months after the wedding that never truly happened, I found myself standing in a quiet garden just outside Columbus, Ohio. This time, everything felt different. There were no chandeliers, no grand estate, no carefully curated guest list designed to impress. Just a small group of people who mattered, and a simple wooden arch wrapped in white flowers, swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. Lily stood beneath it, waiting. Her dress was nothing like the first one. No elaborate lace, no dramatic train, just soft fabric that moved naturally with her, catching the light in a way that made her look free. That was the word that came to me. Free. Andrew stood beside her, his hand resting loosely at his side, his expression calm but full of emotion. When he saw me approaching, he smiled. Not the polite, controlled smile I had seen so many times before, but something real. "Ready?" he asked softly. I nodded. Because this time, I was. Lily turned as I reached her, and for a moment we just looked at each other. No tension, no doubt, just understanding. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied. She took a small step closer. "Will you walk with me?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "Walk with you," I repeated. She nodded. "I don't want to walk down alone," she said. "Not anymore?" My throat tightened. "Are you sure?" I asked gently. She smiled, her eyes glistening just slightly. "There was never anyone else who deserved to be there," she said. "You were the one who stayed." The words settled deep in my chest. Years of doubt, of wondering if I had done enough, given enough, been enough. And in that moment, I had my answer. I reached for her hand. "Then I'd be honored," I said. The ceremony began simply. No grand announcements, no rehearsed speeches, just a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful was about to take place. As we walked together side by side, I felt something shift inside me. Not the sharp ache of grief that had followed me for so long, but something softer, something steadier, a sense of closure for the past, for Thomas, for the version of my life I had carried for decades without fully understanding. When we reached the front, Lily squeezed my hand before stepping forward. Andrew took her other hand, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, grounded, present, real. The vows they spoke were different this time, less polished, more honest. Andrew spoke about choosing truth even when it was difficult, about building something that wasn't based on appearances but on trust. Lily spoke about resilience, about learning that love isn't just about who stays when things are easy, but who stands beside you when everything falls apart. And when it was time for them to exchange rings, I felt the tears come again. But this time they didn't feel heavy. They felt right. After the ceremony, there were no elaborate receptions, just a long table set beneath the trees, homemade food, laughter that came naturally, conversations that didn't feel forced. Margaret was there. She had reached out a few weeks after the wedding asking if she could speak with me. We met in a quiet cafe. She told me everything she knew, not just about Thomas, but about the years that followed, the decisions she had made, the things she had been too afraid to face. It didn't erase what had happened, but it mattered. And over time, I saw something in her change. She wasn't trying to protect an image anymore. She was trying to rebuild something real. That's why Lily had invited her. Not because everything was forgiven, but because the truth had finally been acknowledged. Edward wasn't there. He had stepped down from his company after an internal investigation was reopened. Several former associates came forward once the story began to surface. There were legal proceedings still unfolding, consequences that would take time. But for the first time, he wasn't in control of the narrative anymore, and that in itself was a kind of justice. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Lily found me standing near the edge of the garden. "You're quiet," she said, stepping beside me. "I'm thinking," I replied. "About him?" she asked. I knew who she meant. Thomas. I nodded. For a long time, I thought I had lost him because he chose to leave, I said. I carried that for years. And now she asked. I looked out at the fading light. Now I know he didn't, I said, and somehow, that makes it both harder and easier at the same time. She nodded slowly. I wish I could have known him, she said. So do I replied. We stood in silence for a moment. Then she reached for my hand. But I know enough, she said. I know he loved us. And I know you never stopped fighting for me. I squeezed her hand gently. That was never a question, I said. She smiled. I think it was, she admitted. At least, for a little while. I nodded. That's okay, I said. We all have moments where we don't see clearly. She looked at me, her expression soft but certain. Not anymore, she said. And in that moment, I believed her. Because what we had been through, it hadn't broken us. It had forced us to see each other more clearly than ever before. The truth had been painful. It had taken things from us, but it had also given something back, something stronger. Something real. As the evening settled into quiet laughter and gentle conversation, I realized something I hadn't expected. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't carrying shame, not about my past, not about the life I had lived, not about the choices I had made, because the truth had finally come out, and with it came freedom. Not just for me, but for my daughter. And the life she was now building. A life that wouldn't be shaped by secrets, or silence, or fear, but by something far more powerful, honesty, love, and the courage to stand in the truth, no matter how long it takes to find it. Sometimes the most painful truths arrive too late to fix what was broken, too late to return what was lost, but never too late to change what comes next. For years, I believed I had been abandoned. I carried that belief like a quiet weight, one that shaped how I saw myself, how I raised my daughter, and how I understood love. But the truth was different, and while it didn't erase the pain, it gave it meaning. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. We don't always get the full story when things fall apart. Sometimes silence hides the truth. Sometimes fear buries it. And sometimes it takes decades for it to finally come to light. But when it does, we have a choice. We can hold on to the past the way we believed it happened. Or we can have the courage to face what really happened and rebuild from there. If you've ever been hurt by something you didn't fully understand, I want you to know this. You are allowed to ask questions.
You are allowed to seek the truth, and you are allowed to heal even if the answers come later than you hoped. Tell me, what would you have done if you were in Lily's place? Would you have forgiven your mother right away, or would you have needed time? And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps stories like this reach people who might need them more than we realize. Also, let me know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? I'd truly love to hear from you.